Hey there, welcome back to the channel. Today's Q&A video is going to be on a topic that I get asked fairly often, and there does seem to be some confusion about it. So what we're going to deal with today is, can you legally take pictures at a fire scene? So without any further ado,
Battalion 2, Engines, 11, 27, 7, and 22, Investigator 1, Ladder 27, and Safety 1, House Fire, CO1 Maple Street, Army, Echo, Battalion 2, Engines, 11, 27.
all right, I'm going to begin this video with a couple of basic disclaimers. First of all, I am not an attorney. I don't play one on TV. This isn't official legal advice. However, I was a criminal justice instructor and I have taught some basic laws surrounding crime scenes and things like that. So, but I'm not an attorney and this is not intended to be legal advice. Second disclaimer is this video is only about the United States. If you're watching somewhere else, you know, obviously different countries have different rules, so I don't profess to understand, or I'm not telling you what you can do in those countries, so not included there. In fact, this is USA focused, not specific to any particular state. I'm really going to look at sort of the general federal laws and constitutional protections that might apply, but there may be specific laws in your particular state that may be applicable. So obviously I would tell you it's important to do all your own research. Also, if you are a member of a department or in any way associated with that department, the rules may be a little different in that you have to follow the rules and regulations of your agency. So if your agency says you cannot take photos at a scene, or you can't wear a video camera on your gear, then you're obligated to follow your department rules or you're subject to discipline from them. So this really applies to folks independent of the fire service who want to go out and take photographs at a fire scene. So you're out on the street, you're at a fire scene, and you want to take photographs of the firefighters and the apparatus and the scene in general. Is that allowed, or do you need permission, or are you running the risk of being arrested? And the very short answer is no. Again, with a couple of important disclaimers. But generally, if you are in a place where you are legally allowed to be, so if you're on a public street or a public sidewalk and you're allowed to be there, you can photograph anything that you could capture in that space. The folks that you're going to photograph, I'm assuming this is the firefighters, they don't have any reasonable expectation of privacy while they're out in public doing their job. Can you photograph citizens and civilians? And again, the answer is generally yes, although I would probably recommend that you try and minimize putting citizens or civilians in your photographs unless they're really relevant to the photograph, and even then I would be hesitant, especially if they're victims. You don't want to include them. What about a crime scene? Crime scene, generally the same thing, even if you're in public, although you do have to be a little more cautious, and this might also apply to a fire scene, is that if you're taking pictures, it is possible that your photograph could capture evidence related to that investigation. And if your photograph, your camera contains evidence of an investigation, it could theoretically be seized by the police or the fire department. Now, when I say seized, again, there are some legal restrictions that do come into play, and they're important and need to be followed. But it is not unusual. I have been at fire scenes and photographed fire scenes, and I've talked to the fire investigators, and they'll ask, were you here early enough that you got pictures of the fire before the fire department arrived on the scene or before the firefighting efforts, especially if it's been a fairly extensive fire, it's possible that photographs early on in the fire scene could help with their investigation. For me, that's no problem. If I have pictures that are relevant and can help, I am more than happy to turn those photographs over to the investigators or the fire department. Same thing is true if you're at a crime scene and the police ask. It may be that your camera contains evidence of a crime, and if it does, then there is a procedure that the police can seize that. When I say seize, again, generally what we're talking about here is I'm not talking about they can come and just take your camera away from you. There's a due process system, and specifically what applies here is the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that basically says, as a citizen or as a person in this country, you have the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. So they just can't come up and take your camera. However, the Fourth Amendment also addresses how they can, and basically it's with a warrant. And if they get a search warrant that says they can seize your camera, then you would have to turn that camera over to them. The fire department is part of the government, and so they are also obligated to follow the guidelines spelled out by the Fourth Amendment. Again, basically the Fourth Amendment says you got to have a warrant to make entry and to seize evidence. And so the police, anytime they're conducting an investigation, will typically get a search warrant to do that investigation. Interestingly, or you may ask, how come the fire department, they don't have to get a warrant? And if it's true, there's a recognized exception to the requirement for a warrant that basically says if it's an emergency circumstance, you can make entry and you can take action based on those emergency circumstances. And obviously, going to a house that's on fire, it wouldn't make sense that the department would have to apply for a search warrant to then go back, wait for the warrant to come through, and then enter and extinguish the fire. So the fire department can enter a house and extinguish the fire and determine the cause of that fire without first obtaining a search warrant. So that's one of the exigency rules that apply to the fire department based on the Fourth Amendment. Another consideration is when you're on private property. Most of what I've talked about so far deals with being on public property, where you're allowed to be. If you are on private property, that's a little bit different. And you can certainly be excluded from private property. And I've had that happen, in an apartment complex or a shopping center where someone doesn't want pictures being taken. If you're on private property and they ask you to leave, you may have to leave. Again, anything you can photograph from a public area is acceptable, but like I said, going onto private property, that changes things, and at that point you're subject to the wishes of the property owner or the agent on that property. And if they don't want you on the property, they can ask you to leave, and they can have the police remove you if necessary. So if I'm leaving that public area, I always like to ask permission, and I've done that. I've been at fire scenes, and the good thing is when there's a fire, there's a lot of people out, and I've gone to people who are neighbors and asked if it's okay if I walk up their driveway to take some photographs. And again, explain what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and what I'm going to be taking photographs of, and I've typically not had any problems with that. So if you're going to be on private property, make sure you have permission to be on private property. Even in public areas, there are still some limitations. And again, think about if someone has a reasonable expectation of privacy. The big thing is here, you can't necessarily stand in a public street and then photograph in through someone's window into a house, right? Inside their house, they have a reasonable expectation of privacy. So I wouldn't suggest doing that. So consider what's being shown in your photographs. There are a couple of exceptions to places you can photograph. One of the big ones is military installations, and even though they may be public, they're owned by the government of the United States, you can't photograph on most military installations, defense contractors, things like that, where they can keep people out. You can't photograph those. But otherwise, again, generally, you can photograph anything in public. That includes fire scenes and crime scenes. Just understand that if your image captures evidence that may be relevant to that, it may be that the agency involved may want to obtain that, and they have the right to go and get a search warrant if necessary if you're not willing to give it up. One other note about public places: it is certainly conceivable you might be on a scene and part of the scene extends into that public area. The fire department or the police department, they have the right to close that off and exclude you from that scene. So even though it may be a public area, if they tell you you have to stay behind a certain line or something, they can do that. Again, that's typically done for safety reasons or investigative purposes. So just because, a traffic crash happened in a city intersection doesn't mean you can walk up to the intersection. If they've closed it down, then they can legally exclude you from that area. Another point sometimes someone will bring up is, well, don't you have to have a release, a photographic release from anyone that you take a picture of, so that you can use their photograph? And in some cases you do. That is typically for commercial photography. Commercial photography is photography intended to sell a product. So if you're going to use your photograph as an ad to sell some product, then you would want to have a release from any of the folks who appear in that photograph. However, if you're just taking street photography, you're out on the street taking photos of what's happening in public, you don't necessarily have to have a model release for each of the folks who appear in that. The difference is you're not selling a product. Even if you're selling your photos, you're not selling another product. And that's typically the distinction. And it's the art photography or the art versus commercial photography. So even if you're selling your photos, that's not really commercial photography, even though that is a commercial activity. If you're using your photos to sell a product, Cheerios, then you would want to have that model release form signed by anyone who appears in your photos. When it comes to photographing fire scenes or crime scenes, I would also remind you that I am a former law enforcement officer, and I would tell you that happens a lot. People want to photograph what you're doing. Certainly in the last 20 years with the proliferation of first video cameras and then cell phones that could take good quality videos, we're seeing that more and more. And as I can tell you, it's uncomfortable when people are filming you when you're doing your job. But again, as long as you're doing your job, you shouldn't have a problem with it. And most importantly, you don't have the right as a police officer to make those people stop filming you, right? Again, as long as they are where they're lawfully allowed to be and they are not interfering with the job. So as a photographer, keep that in mind, right? You can't interfere with them. You can't get in the way. You can't go into private property, but you can film and video. So while you have the legal right to walk around and take photos in public, there are a couple of things that I recommend folks do, make their life a little bit easier. And I would remind you, first of all, if you're walking around taking pictures of people and scenes, you're going to attract attention. People are always curious when someone is taking their picture and they want to know why. So the first thing I would tell you is be reasonable, be nice. And if someone says, hey, what are you doing? Explain to them, right? Most of the time I have found the fire departments, the crews have no problem with it. Even most of the people don't have a problem with it, but they want to know what you're doing. So be ready to explain yourself and tell them why you're there and what you're taking those pictures for. So hopefully that helps. A quick overview of what you can and can't do when you're out there taking pictures of folks in public. Again, just a reminder, as long as you are lawfully where you're at, you can typically take photos or videos that's not a problem. You're typically not limited to what you can photograph, so fire scenes and crime scenes are okay. You can photograph infrastructure and highway bridges. Just remember, you're probably going to attract some attention, and it's always easier to be courteous and respectful up front and explain what you're doing and hopefully save you any grief. If the police or someone believes that they have enough probable cause that your photographs may contain evidence of a crime, and certainly fire scenes, that's a possibility, they can seize those with a search warrant. So they would have to obtain that. When dealing with the fire department, I always tell them I'll make those photos available to them if they want them. So if the fire crews or the investigators want the photos, I'm more than happy to share those photos with those folks. But generally, public spaces, you're fine photographing, and you can't be stopped or detained by that unless that stop is reasonable. And it is possible that the police could ask you what you're doing and ask you to explain, and you would be obligated to hopefully explain. But again, this is the United States of America, and that's where these rules apply. You don't have to explain anything. You don't have to say anything to the police if you don't want, but you don't want to make this more cantankerous or antagonistic than needs to be. So that wraps it up. Hopefully you found this helpful, useful. I would encourage you, if you have questions or you think I made a mistake, you can ask a comment or ask a question in the comment section below. Otherwise, again, I would ask you to like and subscribe, give it the thumbs up, and we'll just see you again soon in another Q&A video. Bye.